Randall Bartlett, who's the deputy chief economist at Desjardins. Randall, let's just get straight into the numbers. Give us a sense on how the math comes together for you.
Yeah, I mean, if we see 25% tariffs coming down against Canadian exports tomorrow, maybe an exemption for oil to some extent, closer to 10, but 25 everywhere else, we think it'll be very difficult for the Canadian economy to not fall into recession in the middle part of 2025. And ultimately, with all the knock-on implications of that, higher unemployment rate, and ultimately retaliatory tariffs are just going to exacerbate that and also lead to higher inflation. And so provide a bit of a challenge for the Bank of Canada in terms of contending with a negative negative shock to GDP, and at the same time upward pressure on inflation.
Okay, can you explain the inflation, just sort of for people who are trying to figure out what the actual inflationary effects would be?
Yeah, so it's really multifold, and I think the Bank of Canada did a really good job of explaining this recently, both in the January monetary policy report and then in a subsequent speech that Governor Tiff Macklem gave, is that, you know, when it comes to the actual tariffs applied by the U.S., those have implications for the Canadian dollar, and ultimately is going to impact other things that we re-import from the U.S. as well. So ultimately, that puts upward pressure on domestic inflation to some extent. But then when we apply those retaliatory tariffs, those are just like any tariff that are going to be paid by the citizens, the businesses, and the households of the country importing those goods. So when we apply tariffs to imports from the U.S., we pay those here. And ultimately, that feeds into higher inflation in Canada, both in terms of things that consumers buy right away. So when we're thinking about the CPI, so that'd be consumer goods, that's food, that's the limited gasoline that we import as well, and diesel and that sort of thing. But also the higher prices of intermediate inputs that then feed into manufactured goods and other processes that we have here that keep inflation higher over the medium term than it would be otherwise as well. So ultimately, you get that near-term impact on consumer inflation, and then still some longer-term residual inflationary impacts from the higher prices of intermediate imported goods.
Well, given what you're saying, and given that I would imagine there are some people that like to get U.S. President Donald Trump's ear to talk about the potential economic impacts from tariffs, let's just talk about Canada for a second. Obviously, looking politically strong would be one of the motivations for barking back. But if we are shooting ourselves economically in the foot by doing so, what do you think is going to be the determining factor on whether Canada would actually go down that road, assuming Trump goes down the road we're all expecting him to go down?
Well, I mean, you look at the U.S., and this is something that's going to be a net negative for the U.S. economy, applying tariffs on Canadian imports as well, right? So clearly it's been politically successful in the U.S., even if it's not going to be an economically successful policy south of the border. A lot of those same considerations, I think, are playing out in Canada, where retaliatory tariffs, we know, are going to they're going to exacerbate the economic downturn, make inflation higher in Canada than it would be otherwise. But at the same time, there's a lot of polling that suggests that it is fairly popular among Canadians, even though, among our conversations with business executives, it's not something that is necessarily popular in the business community. It is relatively popular politically in Canada, and so there's a motivation for policymakers to bring this in and take what they hope, I think, would be short-term pain in order to be able to create some additional pain on the U.S. as well, and hopefully by doing so convince the U.S. administration to take the tariffs off fairly quickly.
All right, Randall, before I let you go, I want to try to game out what Canada is going to do if we see a worst case scenario, because I'll tell you, if this is a game of chicken, we're getting awfully close at this point. And during the COVID pandemic, the simple solution from central banks around the world was basically to flood the system with money. And then, we paid the inflationary cost for that down the road. But if, to your point, this scenario is going to put the Bank of Canada against the ropes to a certain extent, how much fiscal support can Canada realistically offer if the economy is very quickly weakening? Like, what is going to be our internal response while we're fighting tariffs with tariffs?
Yeah, we think in terms of the Bank of Canada that in a situation where we get 25% tariffs on everything but energy and 10% on energy, and ultimately those are sustained for a prolonged period of time through, say, the duration of the Trump administration, we could see the policy rate come down to maybe 150 basis points and by the early part of 2026. But it's one of those situations where the Bank of Canada will have to balance those higher inflationary pressures, some of which may be sustained, with the fact that there's weakness in the Canadian economy. We think they'll err on the side of more of weakness in the Canadian economy and lower GDP and higher unemployment, helping to support the Canadian economy. But there is still those considerations around that higher inflation. When it comes to fiscal policy, the federal government's hamstrung now while Parliament's not sitting. But ultimately, once we get a general election and we have Parliament resume, we think the federal government does have room to increase fiscal stimulus as needed. What we'd like to see is that fiscal stimulus is meant to be more targeted towards supporting a transition to a different sort of economic equilibrium than one which was like COVID, where it was very short-term stimulus that was meant to keep the Canadian economy running while the doors were shuttered to businesses and institutions. But that's not going to be the case this time around. This is going to need longer-term support, which is more targeted to industries that are hardest hit and households that are more deeply affected by that and need to transition potentially to a different type of employment and that sort of thing. So it's going to be a very different shock, and one which is going to need more targeted, more gradual support as opposed to what we saw during the pandemic.
All right. Well, it sounds like there's a lot of work to potentially do. Let's hope they can get back to business as normal in Ottawa sometime soon. Randall Bartlett joining us, Deputy Chief Economist at